all the mass briefs that have the major PFF. So we've got 4 low flying briefings. We've got about 4 instrument flying briefings, none of which have a great deal of any PFF. Visual navigation, I think, what else have we got? We've done stalls and steep turn, eh?
Constant radius turns.
Constant radius turns, yeah, no PFF in that either. So you'll be pleased to know that you've now basically completed all of the PFF stuff. So everything now is a nice break from all of that. So it's more just considerations as opposed to principles of flight. Not much in the way of instructional techniques I need to tell you about this briefing, other than things to emphasize would be decision making. That is huge. Awareness and decision making is huge in this exercise, in low flying that is, in all of these briefings. Look, there are so many examples of incidents and accidents you can use to back up the points in this briefing. Your purpose is not to scare the student by telling them 100 accidents, because there are 100 or more involving low flying, but it's to illustrate or to prove why it's important for them to develop these skills and to never actually go low flying if it's not necessary. So that should be a main focus in this briefing. For your own benefit, make sure you're familiar with what the low flying and terrain awareness requirements are for a student to get their PPL. I usually mention that very briefly in this mass brief. Do have a look at the statistics on low flying and weather related accidents. I will post a few accident reports to the chat at some point this week. So there's so many you can use, and I'll tell you a few stories that I have heard about people I've known who've been involved in incidents and accidents throughout this briefing as well. Again, when you're talking about accidents, never try to lay blame. It's just about, okay, what might have happened here? How could we avoid that happening to us, rather than criticizing what the pilots actually did. There's a lot of pictures to discuss in this slide, in these slides. There's not really much else I need to tell you really. The rest is just presenting it. It would be helpful for you guys to have a good read up of the rules around flying in low flying zones, what the requirements are, as well as what the CAA calls bona fide reasons for flight below 500 feet AGL. So you should have very good working knowledge of what all of those rules are, because you'll be expected to know those as flight instructors. Okay, so I'll present the briefing now. There's not really much else I need to tell you instructional techniques wise. So today is our first look at low flying. It's about the first of 4 mass briefs and many different lessons that we're going to have a look at, where we are flying the aeroplane a lot lower than you're used to. Today's focus is mostly going to be on the considerations and the illusions of operating an aeroplane close to the ground. And our goal by the end of this lesson, and after you've done some low flying training with me on board, is to develop your awareness of the considerations, develop your decision making in relation to the considerations of flying close to the ground. We should never plan to fly lower than is necessary, and we can avoid having to fly lower than necessary with thorough pre-flight and in-flight planning. For example, we assess the weather before we board our aeroplane. We make a decision about whether or not it'll be safe and legal for us to go flying, and if we have doubts, we don't go. Once we get airborne, we scan around the aeroplane for weather. We make decisions about diverting or turning around. So we always have escape options. This briefing will take about 45 minutes to an hour. And as part of your low flying training towards your PPL, we're going to be doing at least 5 hours of training in low flying. Here's our objectives. To fly the aircraft near the ground with confidence and safety, to compensate for the effects of momentum, visual illusions, hazards and stress when operating the aircraft at low level. With developing your awareness of the considerations, illusions and hazards, you will become more confident in operating the aeroplane close to the ground. Have a read of this, quite a sobering thought. And if you ever have a look at the accident and incident statistics on the CAA website, it paints a very clear and sobering picture of those pilots who choose to fly at low level more often than not end up as a statistic. We do not want you to be one of those. So as I said, we never want to fly any lower than is necessary. In this briefing, we'll discuss all the considerations as to why that is. 5 hours of flight training and a few mass briefs is not going to make you an expert at flying the aeroplane close to the ground. This training is designed just to give you the foundational awareness and skills necessary to confidently and accurately fly the aeroplane safely close to the ground and make a decision about what to do. So what exactly do we mean by low flying? By this we mean flight at or below 500 feet AGL. Now, of course, you've already been doing portions of every single flight at or below 500 feet AGL. And some of what you learned today in this briefing will be relevant to every single takeoff and landing that you do from now on, because we are doing a portion of low flying every time we go flying. Why do we actually look at specific training for this? It's because it's not enough just to be told about this on the ground in this briefing. You have to experience these illusions and these considerations yourself in an actual aeroplane, in a controlled, safe environment with an instructor on board to actually get a full appreciation of them. And we will do at least 5 hours of training in the aircraft. So imagine today we're on the way back from Paraparaumu, back to Palmerston North. We've taken off. Initially the weather was good at Paraparaumu, but it has deteriorated out in front of us. Not a very nice picture, is it? Looks reasonably clear at the moment, but only in a few miles' time we can see the visibility is really reducing. Cloud base looks like it's reducing. Maybe it's not legal, and it certainly doesn't look like it's going to be safe if we go any further. So we need to think ahead. What would we do in this situation? Could we turn around and go back to Paraparaumu, land and wait for the weather to improve? Could we divert to another suitable aerodrome? Actually, is it possible for us to go around this weather? Never blindly push on through it, hoping for the best, because this is when more serious problems happen. So it's not just weather-related considerations as to why we might need to fly low level. There are a number of others, and some are perfectly normal situations as well. I used to work for a charter organisation, and we did a number of different low-level operations. Kiwi tracking and bat tracking for the Department of Conservation, where we came down to around 500 feet AGL, flying over forests, picking up the signals that they tagged on the birds or on the bats. We had to be low level for the signals to be picked up. So there's an example of a different scenario other than weather. We also used to do surveying for geological and nuclear sciences, which had us coming down to only 200 feet AGL above the water around White Island. I can tell you that is in fact, that is the most high concentration I have ever had to experience in any flight. Worse than single pilot IFR on a single engine and twin engine aeroplane. You have to be looking outside. You have to be aware of the illusions and the considerations. There is a very fine margin between flying the aeroplane safely and ending up as a statistic. Later on in your training, we're going to be talking a lot about mountainous terrain, rising terrain, and instrument flying procedures. So you will experience all of these things across your training. For now though, every single flight will include an element of low flying for takeoff and landing, and we need to consider the weather-related factors as well. And we've already been doing that. You know that there's been plenty of occasions where we've chosen to not go flying because the weather was bad, so we made that positive decision on the ground before it actually became an issue for us. We've tracked the potential error. So hopefully by now you've realised we should never go low flying for fun. It is something that needs to be well thought out and considered. And we should never ever fly lower than we need to. So never scud running. There are many hazards and risks. We do not want to put ourselves or anyone else on board the aeroplane into this situation. Otherwise, that is what usually happens. You end up as a statistic. And I do not want to read about you in the paper one day. As a tangent, I don't generally like to tell students about lots of accidents, but I once knew a pilot who, actually when I used to fly for this charter company, he used to fly his own aeroplane down for the ski season. He used to come down for a day of skiing and then he'd load his skis back up and go again. And he was killed in a crash a few years ago down in the South Island after he flew into IMC trying to land at an airfield. He was part of a convoy of aeroplanes. There were about 3 or 4 of them that had departed Gore, trying to go to, I don't remember which aerodrome it was, somewhere near the bottom of the South Island. And the other 3 went around the weather and landed safely. He decided to fly through it and flew into terrain, controlled flight into terrain. Contributing factors that the CAA identified is he was known to be an unsafe flight. It was not the first time he had deliberately flown into IMC. It had been reported prior to this accident as well. The statistics show that the pilots who are actually killed in those kind of accidents always have gone into IMC before, so perhaps there's a false sense of security that, hey, I got away with it last time, I'll probably get away with it this time. But he paid the ultimate price. He was known to have broken several other rules as well. He used to do aerobatics in his microlight, which is not an approved aerobatic machine. He didn't have an aerobatic rating. He carried passengers doing aerobatics in a non-aerobatic machine. So you add up all of those things and you can see how these accidents actually can happen. And there are so many different examples. So, you know, you don't have to talk about a specific case, but I have a few up my sleeve that I like to tell people. It's quite sobering, you know, that's someone I knew. I actually went flying with him once. So there are a number of rules that you need to be aware of. Now, we're quite far into your PPL training now, so you've done the air law exam and you'll be aware that there are rules around operating in a low flying zone and there are rules around operating an aircraft below 500 feet AGL. So it's time for you to start familiarising yourself with those rules again now that we're up to the practical low flying part of your flight training. Rule 91.311 and 91, I think it's 113, both deal with rules at low level. So make sure you have read those. We'll discuss them in more detail when we actually do this flight. Most of our low flying training will be conducted in one of our 2 low flying areas, which is designated areas for low flying where we can go below 500 feet AGL. Outside of that though, we're not permitted to go below 500 feet AGL. It's as a tangent, make sure you guys also have a read of the low flying safety information bulletin, which deals with the whole whether you can go below 500 feet AGL for a forced landing without power. You can find more guidance in there on that. So imagine we are close to the ground. We've departed from Paraparaumu. We've seen that weather from back a few slides. We've been forced closer to the ground. We haven't yet made the decision to turn around or divert anywhere. It's really important that we develop a way of being able to judge height without having to keep our eyes inside looking at the altimeter or trying to figure out what the elevation is on our iPads or on the MFD. We're close to the ground, visibility is bad, very fine margins. We need to have our heads up looking outside. So we need to start judging what different heights look like. Now you've had a bit of an introduction to this already. As you know, in your circuit training, the ideal circuit would be to turn crosswind at 500 feet AGL, to final at 500 feet AGL. In your forced landings without power, we've had a look at different heights, judged the scale of objects from those heights. So you've started doing this process already, but today is going to be what objects look like from 500 feet AGL or lower. The quick assessment. And the altimeter is not a good way of trying to figure out what the elevation is, because it doesn't tell you the elevation, it tells you your height above sea level. You think about those flights we've been in the southern training area, the elevation is all flat, sea level constant, isn't it? But northern training area, constantly changing. There's no one set elevation, so the altimeter is particularly useless in that situation. So here's a picture taken from an aeroplane in the southern training area, flying at 500 feet AGL. What you want to do in this flight today is take note of what the scale of different objects looks like from 500 feet AGL. So how big do buildings appear? How big do cars and trucks and stock and power lines and pylons actually appear? These will be cues as to how high the aeroplane is actually flying. Why is that so important? Well, in this picture here, it looks like we've got relatively nice visual conditions, a few showers out towards the ranges there, but looks all right out that way. Have a look at this one though. Visibility is reducing, cloud base looks low, you might even have a few droplets of rain on the windscreen. We'd probably be pretty stressed in this situation, distracted. We need to be keeping our heads up, eyes outside, being able to look down at the ground with reasonable confidence and saying, yes, I know what height we're at. That is important because you will use that information to determine whether or not it is safe for you to continue this flight, either around the conditions, through the conditions, or whether you have to think about another option, which would be to land. And we'll deal with that in a separate briefing on precautionary landings. There are many hazards we have to be aware of when flying at low level. One consideration is the difficulty of navigating at low level. It could be that it's a nice sky clear day, no cloud, excellent visibility. We're at 500 feet AGL. Even navigating in those conditions is difficult because we cannot see very far. Now you add into the mix low cloud base, bad visibility, rain and showers, and you can very quickly see how you would get disorientated and might lose your situational awareness and get lost. So when we are navigating in conditions of either low ceiling or bad visibility or both, it's important to try and find some visual features for us to follow. So let's go back to that scenario. We're coming back from Paraparaumu to Palmy. Conditions have started deteriorating. From your local knowledge of the southern training area and when we've been to Paraparaumu, hey, what features are there that you could use to help get back to Palmy? Not necessarily all the way, but back in the general vicinity. That's a genuine question for you guys. What is there? What could you use to navigate in those bad conditions?
You can see the coast, potentially the coast.
An excellent resource that takes you all the way to Foxpine, and you've got that as a alternate option. And from Foxpine, you're pretty close to the control zone. What else?
Rivers?
Yeah, rivers. Got a pretty major Manawatu River. Anything else?
Highways.
Yeah, big main roads. Yep. What else?
Got towns.
Yep, towns. Yes, towns, but that's sort of point to point as opposed to a continuous feature. So useful, absolutely useful, but we're wanting a continuous feature, ideally.
The ranges.
Yeah, even the terrain itself can be useful. And there's two more things I can think of.
Railroad?
Yeah.
Railroad.
Yep. And power lines as well, pylons, especially the high tension pylons because they're marked on your maps and very clearly shows you where you're going to end up. So those are all things that we could use. Yeah, there are a few other hazards we need to be aware of when we're operating at low level. You think about the flights we've done from high level, 3, 4, 5,000 feet or above, and you look down at the terrain, even though you know the terrain has been hilly or mountainous, it takes on more of a two-dimensional look. You cannot see the contours as well from high above. But as we're flying lower down, say 500 feet AGL, the terrain starts taking on more of a 3D effect. And we can see the terrain and objects, hazards, rising up in our peripheral vision. We become very much more aware of what is going on around us. And so we have to keep thinking about how is the aeroplane positioned in relation to that terrain, because now we've got less space to maneuver. And we have to think in the same terms of obstacles, power lines, any obstacles that might get in our way. So terrain 3D effect is evident at low level. By now we've had a bit of a chat about false horizon as well. So do you remember what horizon was? Hopefully they can recap on that. Now, when we're flying low level, we may not have a visible horizon. It could be terrain's in the way, we might have bad visibility, maybe a cloud is obscuring it, or a combination of all of those things. We potentially close to the ground and potentially have also slowed the aeroplane down. The last thing we want to do is misidentify the horizon. Why do you think that is? Hopefully they'll say, oh, because we might enter a high nose attitude and stall, or we might set a low nose attitude and fly into terrain. Both are considerations there. So it's important to project the known horizon and verify the nose attitude on your instruments. We cannot accept getting slower or lower when we are already at 500 feet AGL and potentially have slowed the aeroplane down. You've experienced on the approach and taking off already, it can be a little bit more turbulent, and then as we get higher it becomes a bit smoother. And so in low flying, mechanical turbulence of trees, buildings, hills, other obstructions can make the flight more turbulent. This increases workload, stress, and hazards as well. Imagine coming back from Paraparaumu, we've got all of these things low down to the ground. We've decided we need to make a radio call to Palmerston Tower to hurry up and get on the ground as soon as possible. We've made our call, but we're too low for the tower to hear us. Probably going to add to stress, isn't it? We're going to start panicking. What about worst case scenario, we make a pan-pan call or a mayday call when it goes unanswered? We're going to stress even more, aren't we? So that's something we need to think about too. You've experienced rain on the windshield already. What did you notice about your visibility? Oh yeah, it's worse, but your height perception and your distance perception becomes distorted with moisture on the windscreen. I generally find it's not as bad in a DA40, but if you have ever flown Cessnas, they form big droplets on the windscreen and they just stick there. They don't form streaks like they do on the DA40. So trying to land a Cessna in rain is horrendous. Like you have to look out the side window to judge how high you are when you start rounding out, because it's just, you imagine water magnifies things, right? So it totally distorts your vision straight ahead. So you've got to look out here out your side window to judge your landing attitude and so on. Don't have to do that in a DA40. Why do you think that is? This is a total tangent question, but why is it so horrendous in a Cessna and not in a DA40?
The DA40 is more like a bubble, like the Cessna's kind of like more of a flat sort of, not so like rounded windshield.
Yep. So what?
So like when the raindrops hit the windshield on the Cessna, it's like basically just getting held in place on this stuff.
Why would it get held in place though?
Like laminar flow at the DA40. It's kind
It
of
has to be something to do with the boundary layer, the behaviour of the boundary layer, because it's more blunt on a Cessna versus quite streamlined and smooth on a DA40. When we talk in terms of momentum for low flying, we're really considering the space required to manoeuvre the aeroplane. And this is affected by both the speed and the weight of the aeroplane. So we constantly have to be thinking about how are we positioning the aeroplane. Will there be enough space for us to turn around close to that terrain or close to that cloud without going into IMC? So these are all things we have to think about. So how stressful do you think that would be if we were coming back from Paraparaumu with the weather we saw in the slides a few pages ago, having to think about all of this stuff, combined with the fact that you've got no low flying training at this point? Not good. So let's come back to that scenario again. Coming back from Paraparaumu, weather unexpectedly deteriorated on our way back to Palmy. So what have we got here? We've got a few hazardous conditions. We've got a false horizon. Who knows where the horizon is there? Where do you reckon it would be? See what they say. You know, it's definitely not going to be down here. We wouldn't want to identify that as the horizon because we'll set a low nose attitude and probably fly into terrain. It's not going to be probably here where the cloud meets the terrain. That would probably result in a high nose attitude and either a stall or inadvertent entry into IMC. And it's probably somewhere in between. It's probably about halfway up the ranges there. So we've got to imagine in these situations that the terrain is transparent. Imagine where the coastline would sit in the distant horizon. Set the nose attitude and confirm performance on the instruments. We've also got streaks starting to form on the windscreen, so that visibility, height perception, distance perception has started reducing. So we're starting to experience some of those hazardous conditions. So what shall we do? We need to consider, do we turn around, go back to Paraparaumu? Do we divert to one of the other aerodromes in the southern training area? Can we go around the weather? These are things we need to think about. We never want to persist through deteriorating conditions, hoping for the best. We must always think about the what ifs. What could happen if I proceed through these conditions? I might find myself in these kind of conditions. Even worse, visibility now is really reducing. Cloud base is even lower. What if I was already only at 500 feet AGL? I'm going to have to descend even lower now. Even more hazards, even more risks. What would we do now? Well, I would be thinking very quickly about turning around, diverting. Maybe we even have to think about what is known as a precautionary landing, landing somewhere close by, which we'll deal with in another briefing. Hopefully those are still options to us at this point, but we may have run out of options if we've made the decision to hope for the best. So we don't want to be that pilot. As instructors, you have to be very careful with this as well. This is tangent, obviously, but just before I started, an instructor was out doing a dual flight with his 2 students and wasn't, for whatever reason, wasn't keeping a close enough eye on the weather, or didn't appreciate how quickly the weather was changing, and they actually had to divert. I think in the end they landed at Foxspine or something, but the cloud base plummeted, the visibility plummeted, and they only just managed to land at Foxspine before conditions really bombed out. They happened to an instructor. If it can happen to an instructor, it can certainly happen to a student, it can certainly happen to a private pilot. So you don't necessarily have to tell your students that. In fact, I wouldn't, but know that this can happen to all of us. So as instructors, you've got to keep a very good awareness of what's going on around you as well. Don't get so distracted trying to teach a lesson at the expense of your ability to land somewhere. So always have options. Now again, let's come back to that scenario. Coming back from Paraparaumu to Palmy, forced down low because of a low ceiling. Visibility is all right at the moment. What sort of hazards or obstacles do you think we might have coming back to Palmy? So ask the question, you know, they shouldn't have a general idea of what we've got in the southern training area. We've got things like power lines, pylons, buildings, trees, terrain. Hey, maybe there's even other airplanes. We must not assume that just because the weather is bad, that there's no one else out there. Because there have been near misses in conditions barely VMC before. Wires can be quite a tricky hazard to navigate, as it were, because they become very difficult to see in certain conditions. So if you were aware of high tension pylons in front of you, how are you going to know where the wires are? They'll be impossible to see. What would you do then if you had to cross pylons and you couldn't see the wires?
Go over the pylon itself.
Yeah, because you know that the wires do the same. So actually cross there, the highest point where you know there's going to be no wires, right over the top of the tower. This is something I explore with people on the mountain flights. So have a bit of a discussion on some of these things. Birds, there's an increased bird activity, so we have to be very careful when particularly using this low-flying zone out to the south, because there's an increased seagull activity, particularly if they've just ploughed any paddocks or they have cut any crops. Often quite a lot of seagulls around. So the lower we go, the more hazards there are. So we must keep our head up, our eyes outside, and be listening on the radio at all times, being prepared to take action.
Sorry, you said the birds was in Lima 366?
Particularly because we're close to the coast, and seagulls sometimes you get after they've ploughed paddocks or they've chopped crops. Sometimes it can be really bad in there.
Okay.
Yep. Coming back to Palmy now, looks like conditions have improved a little bit, but we're still at low level. Can you see any hazards here? And I'll probably say, oh yeah, trees, buildings, you know the ranges are not close by. What you can't see very well is there's a big high tension power line there. Let's zoom in a little bit. Hard to see, in these lighting conditions. Not all wires are marked on maps, so again, you must never fly lower than necessary. Pylons are pretty tall, they're probably a couple of 100 feet. So if we are flying only at a couple of 100 feet to get under some low cloud, we don't want to end up hitting them. Again, so many examples of aircraft, helicopters and aeroplanes hitting wires. Often it's top dressing aircraft, but not always. These photos here illustrate the effect of the sun on your ability to see some hazards, like power lines. So in the top diagram here, you can see the actual pylon towers themselves. There's one there, looks like there might be one over here possibly. But you can't see the wires, can you? Pretty hard to see anything, and this is looking into the sun. So you've got the glare limiting your visibility. Now this picture down the bottom here is looking away from the sun. Note how the sunlight now illuminates the wires and makes it really easy to see them. This increases the safety. So always think about how you're positioning the aeroplane in relation to hazards as well, if you do know that there are power lines there. Human factors, awareness, situational awareness, decision making is huge in low flying. By now you've heard me say several times, and I'm going to say it several more times during this briefing, that we can avoid this whole necessity of flying low level by making thorough decisions on the ground, assessing weather, making a go, no-go decision, assessing the weather when we're air, and making an early decision about diverting or turning around or landing somewhere before we get totally stuck in deteriorated conditions. We must always think of the what-ifs. We must always have options, have a way out. And if we do all of those things, this will never happen to you. It would be a pretty stressful situation to find yourself in, as I think I've highlighted as we've gone through this briefing. So think about close to the ground, lots of hazards, difficulty navigating, bad visibility, no horizon, radio calls going unanswered. Attention is going to become very restricted. Narrowed is the word, I should say. Attention is going to become very narrowed. And you know what? The first thing we tend to do when we get overwhelmed is we stop flying the aeroplane. And it is the one thing that we need to do to keep the aeroplane safe. So we must come back to the old adage, aviate, navigate, communicate. So why do these kind of accidents and incidents happen? A large part of it is hazardous attitudes, whether the pilot is aware of them or not. These often account for why the pilot chooses to fly into deteriorating conditions. And you've had you've studied human factors by this point, so you'll recall these different hazardous attitudes. So let's run through a few examples and see if we can identify what they are. So you run through them. There are some speaker notes on it down here. I really must get there today. What would you say that one is?
Guilty items.
Yep. Also called destination obsession. Yep. I'm sure it will get better just up ahead. What about that one? What do we call that? Couple of different possibilities. Could be invincibility or invulnerability, either of those. This one, I know my way, I've been here plenty of times before. Could be the same, maybe it's kind of now moving into the macho type behaviour as well. I've been in worse conditions than this. Again, it could be impulsive, it could be invincible, it could be invulnerable, it could be macho. Nothing bad ever happens to me. Could be the same. So human factors training on these hazardous attitudes is really important. So again, we come back to our scenario. Coming back from Paraparaumu, we found ourselves a nice feature to follow back towards Palmy. We've got this main river there, the Manawatu River. Conditions starting to deteriorate up in front of us there, cloud base is looking like it's dropping, visibility is reducing, but it looks like we've got a nice clear corridor through there. So what shall we do? Do we fly through there? Do we go around it? Do we divert? Do we land somewhere close by? Depends on the situation. But what could happen if we tried to fly through that corridor? Maybe this starts to happen. Maybe the visibility gets worse. Maybe the cloud base gets lower. Now we're running out of options. We've actually made the situation worse. So don't blindly persevere through deteriorating conditions. We never want to get to a stage where it is the only option left to us. That suggests that a decision was needed some time ago. So we've discussed a little bit about vision already, the impacts of streaks or droplets on the windscreen and distorting your height perception, distance perception, the glare or the sun strike all have an impact on your ability to keep a good lookout for obstacles, other aircraft. And it's important that you keep your eyes outside as much as possible when we're flying close to the ground. Again, it's not acceptable to go any lower than necessary and any slower than necessary. There are very fine margins between safe flight and hitting terrain. We need to keep an eye out for those hazards continuously. You can imagine that your information processing, your ability or your need to acquire and assess new information is pretty high in a situation like this. So it will be pretty stressful. However, we will give you some practice at this in a controlled environment with me on board, and that will get easier for you. As we've already discussed, stress affects your performance. It leads to a narrowed focus, distraction, right when we're in a situation where we really need to be thinking big picture. We need to be aware of the hazards, the illusions, to make a safe decision about how to handle the situation that we found ourselves in. This is not unique to low flying, but we should always fly with a clean windscreen. So be really disciplined with your students on that. I've had several flights where I've got in the aircraft knowing that the aeroplane has a dirty windscreen. I've let them get in, put their seatbelt on, close the canopy, and then I've told them to get out and go clean the windscreen. It's not acceptable to go flying with a dirty windscreen for so many different reasons. If they do that in a flight test, they will fail. But it's not even about that, you know, it's not about passing or failing a flight test, it's about safety. Oops. When we're low flying, we complete HAZEL checks. As you're appreciating now, there's multiple hazards that are not relevant at higher altitudes, so a way of assessing those hazards is to complete a HAZEL check and to configure the aeroplane safely for the conditions that we may find ourselves in. We'll inhibit the torts. We do this for both a real situation where we are caught out low level, but also in all the low flying practice that we do. We don't want that thing squawking at us, distracting us by continuously sounding in the background. As you'll see when we do low flying, we often use the poor visibility configuration. When you teach a student this, that is what it is called, poor visibility configuration, not bad weather. Okay, it's not called that. The CAA emphasises that in their briefing as well, because if you've just got a cloud base that's a little bit low, but visibility is good, as sometimes it is, why slow down to 80 knots and take twice as long to get back to Palmy as the ceiling is getting lower and lower and lower? That makes no sense. But in bad visibility conditions, this is where it's really useful. So we elect to slow the aeroplane down. This reduces the momentum. This has several benefits. It gives us more time to think and plan. Easier to navigate, as you'll see in the flight today. And it also reduces the momentum. So it means we need less space to maneuver the aeroplane. So lots of benefits to slowing the aeroplane down to 80 knots. We also set takeoff flap because at that speed of 80 knots, it increases the visibility. Makes it easier for you to see all those hazards we've just been talking about. A tangent thing here again. I hear so many times people just blindly say, oh, setting flap increases the visibility. And so my next question is then, okay, well here we are at 120 knots. Are Are you telling me the visibility is better at 80 knots with flat than it is at 120 knots? It's not. It's the same. So what it does is it increases the visibility at 80 knots. Because you think about it, slow down, you've got to have a higher nose attitude to fly along, right? That's bad visibility. So setting flat solves that